Yes, Dr. Pickens?
Could you summarize for us what you think are the main reasons why the Ottoman Empire chose to ally with Germany rather than Britain?
Yes, and I think there are two real answers to that, and just for the recording, I'm going to repeat your question. What were the reasons that the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany over Britain? I think there are two major elements to this. The first is cultural. Germany had realized that it had been sort of isolated in Europe, with the exception of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and knew that it was weak, and sort of sought to form an alliance there for some time, and had really been investing economically. That's sort of the second part. The economic investment that Germany put in building the Hajj Railway, helping finance Ottoman projects in much deeper ways than Britain ever did. Britain only sort of ever helped with the Navy. Germany was really training all their troops, and this sort of leads to the cultural aspect of it, is that all the Ottoman troops and officers that went to be educated in Germany, of course, brought back German notions of militarism, and this is specifically very obvious with Enver Pasha, who was, of course, a famous Germanophile. And I think there was, even in the CUP at the highest level, at the very end, Talat Bey and Dave Bey both wanted to stay loyal to Britain, and Enver Pasha overruled them and said, no, they'd go. That he thought the safest bet was with Germany, because the German military would win the war on the ground. Does that answer your question? Yes, sir.
Warren, I just want to ask you, what advice do you think Churchill would give Hillary Clinton or someone today dealing with Afghanistan?
Right. I can't imagine, I mean, I wanted to sort of draw a line in saying that. Oh, yes, of course. I'm sorry. The question was, what would Churchill, what kind of rating would Churchill today give our sort of current leaders, like Hillary Clinton, regarding Afghanistan and, say, Libya? And what I'd say there is that it's very difficult to me imagine a situation where any of our current political leaders would have felt so bereaved over a political military decision that they made that they would have gone and joined the war personally. And I understand that's what Winston Churchill did. He went and fought in the most hellish environment imaginable because he felt that he had screwed up. And I can't imagine, I mean, the last guy I can imagine maybe doing that, Terry Truman. Yes, sir.
In the pictures you showed of Churchill in India as a young man, you have images of him with Sikhs and serving with Sikhs.
Yes.
What role does and Sikhs of course aren't Muslims.
Right.
What role does his experience with Sikhs specifically play in how he thinks about Islam? Is there any sort of interesting mediating role or something that experience?
Right. So just to reiterate, the question was, what was Churchill's relationship with Sikhs as juxtaposed his relationship with Muslims? And the answer to that is, for Churchill, I mean, we have to understand, of course, Sikhism is, in its way, though it's not the same as Islam, is a branch of Islam, or that it came from Islam to some degree. I'm sure that there are Sikh experts who probably disagree with me. But Churchill certainly probably didn't make that distinction. He would have recognized it as some sort of sect of Islam. I mean, we have to understand that Churchill's appreciation of Islam, the religion, not the Islamic world as a culture. Of course, Churchill sort of kept these two things separate. There was the political sphere of the Islamic world, and there was Islam, the religion. Churchill's appreciation of Islam, the religion, was only ever aesthetic. And in fact, when he's colonial secretary in 1920, he has to ask T.D. Lawrence and John Shuckburgh the difference between Shia and Sunni Islam. So, he only sort of has this Victorian notion of the noble Arab Bedouin. Now, as it relates specifically to India, Churchill always includes the Sikhs with the Muslims. He always says that they are great warriors, and in fact, at some point in the 30s, when they're approaching the war, he talks about how the Sikhs and the Muslims made up the majority of the British soldiers in the First World War, and he really appreciated that, so he always would sort of seek to help them. This is why he becomes one of the major proponents for the creation of Pakistan. What's very interesting about that is he's completely wrong. In fact, double 2-to-1 numbers, there were more Hindus than Muslims or Sikhs in the British Army in the First World War, but this wasn't Churchill's perception. So he does put them together, but he is also smart enough to know that they're two different things, but they're sort of kind of the same from his perspective. I hope. Yes, sir.
How did you get along with Lawrence? What was his?
The question was, how did Churchill get along with T.E. Lawrence? They had a very wonderful relationship. Churchill sort of kind of had some hero worship for him, especially if you read the diaries of Colonel Meinhardshagen, who was another advisor at the time. And he almost is jealous of the fact that Churchill listens to whatever T.E. Lawrence says, because he's got this sort of affinity for T.E. Lawrence. Now, I've looked into this to some degree, and part of the reason I think Churchill has such a sort of hero worship is because T.E. Lawrence is a disciple of Wilfrid Blunt. He read Blunt. He and Blunt were friends. He sort of studied. He didn't literally study under Blunt, but he went and visited Blunt. Blunt heavily influenced Lawrence. And of course, Churchill knew Blunt, and in fact arranges for Lawrence to see Blunt on his deathbed. So I think that Churchill sort of sees, what it was. He sort of saw this guy's, this is like my buddy Blunt. Well, we'll have a good time. And so he develops a very deep personal relationship with Lawrence. And of course, Lawrence in the Seven Pillars of Wisdom remarks that he felt like his and Churchill's solution for the Middle East squared the circle that maybe Britain had betrayed its promises to the Arabs. And he felt like the solution that he and Churchill came up with was the best sort of solution that was on the table. So I think that there was a mutual respect between the two men. And of course, there were times when they disagreed, but for the most part, Churchill would listen to to Lawrence, and would override other sort of more Zionist elements in the Middle East, such as Meinhardshagen, who was a being of Zion.
I would ask you about the Zionist aspect of Churchill. That's not a story.
That's a whole other. I will briefly comment on Churchill and Zionism. There is a huge school of thought that says Churchill was a Zionist. There's enough evidence for it to go either way. In fact, there are two books called Churchill and Zionism. One's written by Martin Gilbert, and one's written by Michael Cohen. And they reach completely different conclusions. What I would say is that while Churchill, I wouldn't say he was a Zionist, and to quote Churchill, he always said that he was wedded to Zionism, in the same way that he said he was a buttress of the church, always from the outside. And you can see there are several times, and this doesn't show up in Gilbert so much, but there are several times when Churchill disagrees with what the Zionist government is doing. And for instance, in his second premiership in the 50s, he agrees to back Jordan if they go to war with Israel, because the British government doesn't lie to its dependents. As a matter of duty, it would back Jordan. So, there are moments when it's easy to see, and you can make the case. What Michael Cohen says is that Churchill becomes a Zionist as a fiat accompli. He does it after the fact, once it's fashioned. I think you can make that argument. I don't know that he was ever a true Zionist. I think he was wedded to it.
Not that this is talked about Lloyd George, but why would he not come to Churchill's conclusion in the securing of the northern border? It just makes sense that England's alliance would preserve that border, preserve their investment in India. What's the politics that Lloyd George will not hear that argument?
Well, Lloyd George is a Gladstonian liberal, but he's also a social liberal. And if you'll remember, when Churchill wants to get people together to sort of knock out the Russian Revolution, to kill it in its crib, Lloyd George thinks this is crazy talk and refuses to support it, because Lloyd George doesn't necessarily think that Soviet Russia is that bad of a thing. Let it sort of work itself out. So, not that, Lloyd George just wasn't as vehement about going after it. He sort of thought that Churchill was sort of crazy at times. And I think, Lloyd George and Churchill were good friends, but at the same time, they would have sold each other out in a minute if they thought it bought them a political guarantee. There's some really interesting notes when they met with Michael Collins in Ireland. He wrote in his personal notes at the meeting that Lloyd George would say anything, and that Churchill would sell out his mother to get what he wanted. Literally, Michael Collins. Did you have a question, sir?
Yes, sir. What role, if any, did Churchill have in setting up the protectorates after World War I?
The question is, what role, if any, did Churchill have setting up the protectorates? Actually, he had probably the most important role, and that was as colonial secretary. So it was his vision that they sort of worked to put together. He obviously wasn't on the ground, but he worked with Percy Cox and T.E. Lawrence. I mean, he set up the Middle East Department. In fact, he brought the term Middle East into the official British lexicon in a way that had never been before, because prior to that, it had always been the Near East or the Levant or the Orient. So Churchill was very much sort of ahead of the game in that he recognized that the Middle East was its own problem, and he sort of went in and called the Cairo Conference in 1921 to sort of determine what was going to happen. And with reference to the Zionist thing, you know, they set up the protectorate in Iraq. They make sure that King Hussein's sort of set up in Arabia, and then they don't know what to do with Abdullah, Faisal's brother. What are we going to give him? So he takes the protectorate of Palestine and cuts it in half at the Jordan River and says everything to the west of that, now everything to the east of that is going to be Arab territory, and everything to the west going to the Mediterranean would be Zionist territory, which absolutely crushed Chaim Weizmann, the sort of Zionist representative in London. So Churchill actually had a whole lot to do with the setting up of the protectorates. And that is by itself a gigantic talk. I would love to get into it. That's a whole other thing. Yes, sir.
Was Churchill a supporter of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations? Was he an advocate or
Was Churchill a supporter of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles? Churchill was a supporter of the League of Nations. And his good friend, the Aga Khan, of course, became sort of the leader in the 30s. So Churchill advocated that, but Churchill was never really on board with the Treaty of Versailles. He, at one point, thought that it was too harsh. Now, when Germany starts rearming, of course, he's the first one to ring the alarm bells. But everybody sort of appreciated that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh on Germany, just as it had been on Turkey. And this is ultimately what leads to the sort of Turkish government collapsing and the rise of Ataturk and all that, is because these were too harsh. And all this is in his History of the First World Crisis. And he definitely, he liked the idea of the nation. Another thing that's quite interesting about this is he really had no respect for President Wilson at all. There's, it records in, I think it's Lloyd George died. He and Lloyd George spent New Year's Eve when listening to Wilson's speeches, and they just thought he was talking crazy stuff. I mean, nobody thought that Wilson was going to be able to pull off stuff. They all thought it was, to use the British phrase, cloud cuckoo land. And so they didn't really see it coming too much. Now, once it had been established, they tried to pursue it, but of course Wilson wasn't able to make it happen at home, and so there was really no guarantor. I mean, it seems from my perspective that the League of Nations really was just sort of a failed concert of Europe, and rather than Britain acting as the sort of pendulum to support, it was actually America that was going to be in that place to make sure things were balanced. So, I don't think, Churchill probably recognized that it wasn't a very realistic plan about America.
Not seeing any more questions. Let me remind everyone that if you're not on our mailing list for our twice-yearly newsletter, that you should speak to the undergraduate gentleman in the pink shirt in the back and pick up some of our propaganda literature. And also, let me note that we have a reception with refreshments in the back, so please take the opportunity to chat with Dr. Doctor in a more informal setting. And in conclusion, please join me in thanking him for a very stimulating